Hey, welcome to Let's Chat. Hey, this is Eric Barbie, Public Affairs Officer here in Algiers. How's it going, Algeria? Washwarakum, the best. Masa khair. It is so good. Thank you for joining us on our weekly chat show hosted by the American Cultural Center in Algiers. I'm feeling great tonight for a couple reasons. First and foremost, because we have one of my favorite people at the embassy here to talk to us tonight, Justina Torry. Justina, do you want to say hi before I do my little spiel?
Hello, Algeria.
Awesome. So, today we're going to talk about the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., one of the fundamental civil rights leaders, in the United States, if not the world, who was assassinated in 1968. Every year in January, Americans celebrate his legacy on Martin Luther King Day. But before we get to that, I want to talk about a few things. First and foremost, about our cultural centers throughout Algeria. We have the American Cultural Center in Algiers here at the embassy, but we have also spaces in Oran, Constantine, Orgla, and Bashar. And during pre-COVID and after COVID, these are great spaces, and we're going to keep you posted about opportunities where we can come see you in these spaces, and we can do outreach, and we can interact, Algerians and Americans. So I said I was happy for a couple reasons. First and foremost, Justina, but yesterday was a big day in the United States, and I'm still smiling following the inauguration. It was the inauguration of our president, Joseph Biden, and it was a huge day because it represents the peaceful transition of power and the success that is American democracy. And it was also quite moving to see our new vice president, Kamala Harris, who is the first female vice president of the United States, the first African-American vice president, and the first South Asian, also the first vice president who attended a historically Black college. So it was quite moving to see her take the oath and stand next to the vice president to lead our country forward. So, this is it was an important day for us, and it's been an important week for us as the United States as we honored the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And Justina is going to talk about that shortly. But just to quickly introduce Justina, again, I said she's, before I give her formal bio, I just want to say she's one of the friendliest, most positive people in the embassy. She's been in Algeria 3 years. She wants to stay here as long as she can. She loves Algeria. She's gone on cooking shows on Algeria. And that's quite appropriate because she is the United States Agricultural Attache here in Algeria, representing American farmers, ranchers, and agribusinesses. She's had an awesome, awesome career. And I have to say, I'm a little jealous of all the places you've served, Justina. South Africa, where she covered 10 countries in Southern Africa. Costa Rica, which is just a beautiful, beautiful place. She covered Nicaragua and Panama there. And then she worked at the U.S. mission to the EU in Belgium. So, I mean, I have to say, I'm a bit jealous of your career. She is a native of Missouri, which has a strong agricultural tradition. Justina, when you talk, please tell me whether you say Missouri or Missouri. I would love to know how you pronounce it. I have family there as well, and they have a different pronunciation. And it's a great state that it has a huge, huge agricultural production with nearly 100,000 farms covering 2/3 of the state. So I've talked way too long. I'm going to turn it over to you, Justina, who will talk about the life and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Justina, the floor is yours. And thanks again for joining us, everybody.
So thank you very much, Eric, for that introduction. And hello, all of my friends in Algeria. I hope everyone is well. And thank you so much for joining us. This is a topic that's very dear to me. So I'm going to try my best to make sure that I speak very slowly. But as an African American growing up in the Midwestern part of the United States, Missouri, the state that I'm from, is in the very center of the United States, about 4 hours by car south of Chicago. And so growing up in the Midwestern United States, learning about the life and the struggles and the accomplishments of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is something that we've celebrated and reflected on even before it became a national day of service and an official federal holiday in the United States. I'm not really sure if my slides are coming through or. So many of you probably know quite a bit about Dr. King, and there's too much information for us to cover everything in just one session. So I'd just like to share a few thoughts with you all, but I'd also like to hear your thoughts and your impressions of Dr. King and also his I Have a Dream speech. So on the second slide, which I think I lost my, hello, can you hear me? There we go. Okay. So on the second slide here, basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history, how Dr. King's legacy impacts us today, how his legacy challenges us as individuals and as a community. We're going to visit some of the monuments that honor him, and then we'll have a few fun facts. So to the right, you can see a picture here of African Americans marching in Montgomery, Alabama. So I think this iconic photo really shares the idea of what the peaceful protests were during the time that Dr. Martin Luther King was leading our nation towards a better place. So on the next slide, for many of you that are familiar with the United States, Dr. King was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1929. His birthday is January 15th, so we celebrate his birthday in January. It's usually the third Monday in January. But he's recognized internationally as a respected civil rights activist who helped to organize the first major protest of the African American civil rights movement. Next slide.
Justina, if I may, I would encourage the audience, if you are live, please put in your questions and I will forward those to Justina. And so we'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So please don't hesitate to put your questions forward and we will do our best to answer those. Great. Back to you, Justina. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that because yes, we want to hear from you. We want your questions. We want this to be as informative but informal as possible. The next thing I'd like to touch on is just basically how his legacy impacts us today. So there's some very tangible elements that came out of the civil rights movement that he led. He began this movement in 1955. And basically the movement started, and I have a picture over here on the right. The lady in the picture, her name is Rosa Parks. And so the movement kind of really started, or it gained momentum after Rosa Parks. She was, I believe, a seamstress, and she was, worked a very long day. She was tired. She got on the bus, and at that time, there was a law that required her to give up her seat if a white person came onto the bus. And so she was very tired, and she, wasn't, able to give up her seat. And so she was arrested. And so at that point, I think that's, the point that people generally point to as the beginning of the civil rights movement. In terms of other tangible things that came out of his legacy and how it impacts us today. In 1963, there was the March on Washington, which again, there are many, many iconic photos about this. And this is where Dr. King gave his very famous I Have a Dream speech. And he also was responsible for helping to enact the Civil Rights Act. And so this was passed in 1964, and it is a landmark law in the United States that outlaws discrimination. So you cannot discriminate in the United States. It's law based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, and then later it was amended to add sexual orientation and gender identity. And finally, one of the other very notable, tangible outcomes of Dr. King's legacy that impacts us is he was very instrumental in helping to get the Voting Rights Act passed. And this act prohibits racial discrimination in voting. On the next slide, I think, when I really think about, Dr. Martin Luther King and how his legacy challenges us as individuals and as a community, it really, really encourages us to practice acts of service and to reflect on the principles of our nation, that all people are created equal, regardless of color, gender, or creed, and that we are equal members of the human family. So even though we continue to work to achieve our nation's goals of creating a more perfect union, one of the things that we're all encouraged to do is to make Dr. King's Day of Observance an opportunity for service. So instead of taking it as a day off where you don't do anything, you're encouraged to make that a day where you're actually going out and helping other people, providing some service. Many people volunteer in soup kitchens or just anything that you can do in your community that's positive. And so people are encouraged to do that on Martin Luther King's observance. The picture in this slide is a picture actually from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. So there's so many different places in the United States that celebrate, that remember various different cultures in our country. But this National Museum on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., which is kind of in the same area where the Capitol building is, it displays a lot of history about African American history and about the struggles that African Americans have had, and some of the celebrations and a lot of the culture. So moving on to the next slide. Now I'd like to take you on a little vacation to the United States. It will be a virtual vacation, but there's several monuments that honor Dr. King, and I have been fortunate enough to have visited all of these monuments, and I would encourage all of you, when the opportunity presents itself, to travel to the United States and learn more about Dr. King and his family and his life. So the next slide is a slide of his birth home. And one of the things, I visited his birth home, but one of the things that strikes me right away when I see this slide is you notice that it's a very modest home in a modest neighborhood. It's not a palace. It's not anything regal. It's just a very middle-class, modern, modest home. You can purchase tickets, and a guide will take you through the various rooms of this house, and you'll learn a little bit more about Dr. King and how he lived and how his family lived as he was growing up. One of the things I remember from this tour is I remember that the guide mentioned that he was born in one of the upstairs bedrooms. And apparently he came a little bit before he was expected to come. And so the crib that they were having made for him, it wasn't ready yet. So they pulled out one of the drawers in the chest of drawers and just, put some pillows and things down and made it appropriate for him to stay for a few weeks or a few months until his crib arrived. But this birth home is a designated National Historic Site. It was designated a National Historic Site by Congress in 1980. And as you can see, it's in a modest neighborhood, but also the church where he was a minister is right down the street. In terms of visiting this facility, it's very walkable. It's in a very nice area. And so you're able to see the church, his home, and there is a museum also in the same area. So it's very easy to do in a day, not even a day, maybe a half a day.
Yeah. Justina, you mentioned the church was right down the street, and we have a question from one of our viewers, Sarah, who asks, why would an African-American minister, church leader, lead a civil rights movement? I know that's a complex question, but I'd like to throw it out to you and would welcome your thoughts now or later.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I'd very much like to keep this a conversation. So if there are questions that come in, but, as a minister, I think part of his message was human dignity and that he felt that everyone should be treated equal. So he saw that as an integral part of just, having people to communicate, to get along, to work together so that all of humanity is treated fairly. So it was pretty much an integral part of his mission and his beliefs. So, I think that I think that when you listen to his "I Have a Dream" speech or any of his speeches, one of the things that you hear and that really strikes me is the way that he speaks and the messages that he gives. And a lot of them, of course, he was a Christian pastor, so a lot of his messages came from that faith and that belief. But again, it was an effort to make sure that the message that all people should be treated equally. And at that time, there were laws in place in the United States that did not allow African Americans to maybe eat in the same restaurants or even in the same places in the same restaurants, to sit wherever they wanted on a bus. So those were the things that he was, those were the messages that he was conveying.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Justina. And thank you, Sarah, for the question. Keep the questions and comments coming in. Back to you, Justina.
So the next place in the United States that I had an opportunity to visit is the National Civil Rights Museum. And this museum is located in Memphis, Tennessee. And it is unfortunately the location of where Dr. King was assassinated. He was assassinated on April 4th, 1968 at this hotel. There are some iconic pictures that you will find out there of him on probably the second or third floor of this motel going into his room right before he was assassinated. But today, the hotel, it's still there. It's not a working hotel, but it is a part of the complex where the National Civil Rights Museum is. So next to it, there's a museum with, again, a lot of memorabilia, a lot of historic buildings and exhibits that trace the history of the civil rights movement in the United States back to the 17th century. So this movement didn't just begin with Dr. King, but it began as far back as the 17th century. And, I would argue to say that it continues. But again, if you have the opportunity to visit this complex, there's a lot of history there and a lot of information about the civil rights movement and Dr. King. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is, unfortunately, this museum, of course, at the moment is closed right now. So I think they do have like a virtual visit online because of the pandemic. Obviously they're not letting people in right now, but they do have a link where you can do kind of a virtual visit if you're interested. Sure. And then the next major...
would it be okay if I read a couple of the comments to you and you can react? And then I have one question, if that's all right.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric.
Excellent. From Katie, she comments, Segregation is not only in the United States, it's everywhere in the world. That's one comment. Another comment. Nasima says, there's still a long way to go for equality. As Dr. King said, in the end, we will not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So keep it vocal in the face of injustice. And then here's a question. Amazik Fier says, I saw online several discrimination claims made by African Americans. Do you think Dr. King's dream is real or dead? Is there still work to do? Over to you, Justina.
Wow, thank you. Those are some very great comments and great questions. The first one regarding segregation, I think in my experience as a Foreign Service officer, having the opportunity to travel to many places around the world, to live in many cultures, I think it's a very unfortunate fact that you are correct that there's segregation all over the world. And it's something that, in the human psyche that we all just have to work towards improving, because, you're correct. In many places that I've been around the world, there is very often a group of people that are segregated or discriminated against. We do have a long way to go. I agree with that comment as well. And then in terms of the last question, one of the things I asked myself as I was preparing this presentation is, if Dr. King, if he were alive today, he would be about 92 years old. But what would he think of, our society and what is going on? And so I think when you think about, his movement, it's very difficult to put a place and say, okay, we've accomplished this. It's a continuous process. It's a continuous journey. I think that, in terms of equality, we've made a lot of progress in our country and in other places around the world. A lot of progress has been made, but there's still a lot that needs to be done. And I think that's one of the important reasons to have a day where we can reflect on some of the things that we need to do as individuals to try to help realize Dr. King's dream.
Thank you, Justina. And thank you for those comments. Please on with your presentation.
So the third place that, I'm going to take you to virtually is in Washington, D.C. It is right in the general area of the Capitol building, where you might have seen pictures of the Lincoln Memorial. You might have seen pictures of other Smithsonian museums that are on the mall. And that was one of the things actually I learned when I was preparing this presentation, Eric. I don't know if you know the answer to why the mall is called the mall, but I learned that. But this monument is called the Stone of Hope. And it's a monument next to the National Mall. So it's walking distance. It's in Washington, D.C. in the United States. And this area covers about 1.6 hectares. And it includes this granite statue of Dr. Martin Luther King. And so one of the things that, I thought was really interesting, is why a granite statue? Well, the inspiration for the memorial, the design, is from his I Have a Dream speech. And so if any of you have heard that speech, there's a line in the speech that says, out of the mountain of despair, a stone of hope. And this memorial opened to the public in August 27, 2011. And one of the things that really touched me and that's really significant for African Americans in the United States is there are a lot of other statues and monuments on the mall, but this is the first and only one that recognizes an African American. So again, it's outside, please go when the weather's nice. The other question that I alluded to, just kind of as an aside, Eric, the mall. I learned that the National Mall, that phrase was coined in the 1800s, and it kind of referred to the public grounds. So for those of you that, will be visiting Washington, D.C., on these public grounds, there are a series of museums that are, free to the public on lots of different subjects. But again, if you were to Google Smithsonian's, you'd get more information that you can imagine. So the next slide, just a few.
On the mall,
Go
there
ahead.
was beautiful images yesterday during the inauguration of the thousands of American flags along the mall. And it's heartening to know that the Stone of Hope is right there on the mall.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it's beautiful. I mean, it's absolutely huge. You can't really tell from my picture how big it is compared to, the average human, but it's huge. It's very impressive, and it's very thought-provoking. So also on this slide, I wanted to do a little bit of trivia, some fun facts, because, there's a lot of information out there about Dr. King, but I wonder if anyone knows the birth name of Dr. King, because he was not born Martin Luther King.
That's a good one. If you have an answer, please jump in with the comments, and we will read the name of the first person that gets it. So maybe you want to continue on, Justina, with the different questions, and we'll wait for the answers to come in.
Yes, absolutely. And then if you know the first answer of his birth name, then it will be very easy for you to guess what his family name was, the name that his family called him, because he did not change his name until he was a teenager. So, the name that he was born with, he went by for many, many years before he changed his name. And it's very interesting to note that he didn't just change his name, but both he and his father changed his name, and they changed it to the same name, which is why he's, Martin Luther King Jr., which basically translates, to the second. So his father would have been the first, he's the second, a junior, and then his son, Dr. King's son, Martin Luther King III, is, alive and living in Atlanta right now. And I know that he's been on television quite a bit the last couple of days. But the other thing that, was very interesting and very significant is that at the age of 35, Martin Luther King was the youngest man to have received the Nobel Peace Prize. And so the interesting fun fact here is that was at that time. But now there's a new youngest person to have received the Nobel Peace Prize. And so I don't know if any of our friends that are listening know who that person is, but that is the third fun fact or question. So if anybody knows the answer, please put it in the chat box. And if not, then I'll come back and let you know what the answers are.
Awesome.
Next
Thank you,
slide.
Justina.
You're welcome. Next slide. And so again, Dr. King gave many speeches. He wrote many letters. He, authored a few books, but, there are just so many different quotes from him. But I decided that I wanted to share with you two of my favorite quotes because there's so many. Maybe you've heard them before, but one of his quotes was, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." And then the other quote that, again, really resonates with me as a person is when he says, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." And then
Justina,
I think
we have a question that just came in, if you're willing to take it. It's about the different places that you mentioned. Question is, which one of those is your favorite, if you can actually say that? And what was the emotion you felt when you entered that place for the first time? Over to you.
Wow, that's a very difficult question. I think my favorite location was his birth home. The location in Atlanta, Georgia, that has his home, how he grew up, kind of what molded him. And I think why that location was my favorite is because I had an opportunity. Actually, I visited there more than once, but the last time that I was there, I had an opportunity to take my two very young children there. So that really meant a lot to me. Visiting his the place where he was assassinated, that had a very different feeling. That was a very sad feeling, a very dark feeling of, loss. But I think that all three of the monuments, they've done a wonderful job of paying tribute to him and really, honoring his legacy. So I would encourage you, if the opportunity presents itself, the museum in Atlanta is not far from the airport in Atlanta. So you could probably rent a car and drive there very quickly. If you're in DC, the monument on the mall, it is metro accessible, so it's very easy to get to. And for the Lorraine Hotel, you'd probably need to rent a car, but again, everything is on one complex. So once you make it to the location, you can easily see everything. And depending on how much you want to read or immerse yourself, you could even spend all day there.
That's great. Thank you, Justina. We have somebody that came in with an answer for Dr. King's birth name.
Okay.
A user, Restored Life, says his nickname or real name was Michael. Is that correct, Justina?
Yes, bravo. So he was born Michael Luther King, and he and his father both changed their names to Martin Luther, and his nickname was Mike. So yeah, so people, a lot of his very close family and friends would refer to him as Mike because up until he was a teenager, he was Mike.
That's great. That's great.
And so I think there's just one more slide here. And again, I think many people are familiar with this. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And again, this is a very, well-known quote from Dr. King. And I thought it was just a very appropriate way to end my portion of the presentation. But like I said, I'd really like to hear from all of my Algerian friends. If you heard the I Have a Dream speech? What resonates with you? Please.
Great. And on that, I think we're going to go ahead and play a portion of that speech, which was delivered in front of more than 250,000 civil rights protest supporters on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. So if our good friend and DJ tonight, Salman, could cue that up, we would be most of just 1 minute, and I think it's going to start. There we go.
As the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, from the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream. My poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together.
Okay, great. That was an excerpt, of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech that was right in front of the Lincoln Memorial on the Mall in Washington, D.C. One of the most famous speeches in all of American history, and one of the most moving. Justina, you've seen that quite a few times, I'm sure, and have read it many, many times. What did it feel like to watch it today, and what are your reactions? I'm sure each time we can learn something new from it. Justina, I think you're on mute. If you could just unmute.
Yes, thank you. As I mentioned, growing up in the Midwest, this is something, a speech that, we listen to at least, once a year when we remembered Dr. King. But as I listen to the speech today, in the world that we live in today, I think about, just kind of referring to the question earlier about if Dr. King were alive today, he would be 92. What would he think about the progress that we've made? So we have made some progress. There have been some opinions on racial discrimination that have changed. We have made some progress on opinions regarding policing in the United States. I think that's changing. There have been, fair housing acts. We've also seen, kind of in my sector, which is the agriculture sector, some products that represented images that were not positive images of African Americans that kind of, reinforce the slave mentality Those products, we've seen, multinational companies take those products offline and say that they would revise or change the images. So I think, we're making progress, but there's no, end game. I mean, this is a constantly changing and evolving issue that, we continue to struggle and continue to work with. And I think that, through talking and through trying to understand others that, the movement, Dr. King's movement, it has evolved and changed over the years, and it will continue to evolve and change. But I think that as we accept people for who they are, and as we continue to talk to people, we will continue to make progress.
It's a great point, Justina. Great point. On that, we have a comment from a user, NYNY, says the inauguration yesterday of President Biden is, in my opinion, real proof of Dr. King's strong legacy. What are your reactions to that? Any reflections on what you saw yesterday in Washington? Would love your thoughts on that, Justina.
Well, thank you, NYNY. That's a great question. I couldn't agree with you more. And I think what I would add to that is, yesterday was a very historic and important moment for our country, not just because of the peaceful transition of power, but also we now, as you mentioned, Eric, have a vice president, the first female vice president in the United States of color. And prior to, I think our 45th president was a president of color. And so I think that's progress. I think that, this isn't necessarily a journey where you can say, okay, we've reached our destination, we're done. This is a continuous journey that we're all on. And so I point to these, significant milestones along the journey that make me very proud. President Obama, that, not just, as an African American, but just showing the diversity of our country. I know that a lot of people refer to the United States as a melting pot. And, I've never really liked the melting pot concept. What I really like is the concept of a mosaic. We're very different. We're a nation made up of a lot of different people. And when you put all of those different people together, you get this beautiful mosaic that just incorporates everyone. So I kind of prefer to think of America as, a mosaic rather than a melting pot.
That is a great image. And I think that's a great image to end with, because unfortunately our time is up. I think we could talk about Dr. King at length, and we would love to have you back. Again, our guest today was Justina Torry, the Agricultural Attache at U.S. Embassy, Algiers. It has been a real pleasure. Thank you for sharing your experience, your time. But more than that, Justina, thank you for being such an awesome colleague at the embassy, and a real friend. And it gives me great joy that our two boys have become such close friends this past year. So again, thank you, Justina. We will be back with more presentations in the future for Black History Month over the course of the coming days. And please interact with us on our social media properties, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. We are here to interact, and really during the time of COVID, the best way to do that is virtually. So thank you to all of the Algiers